You know, whether prices are high or prices are low, the cattle market is always top of mind for cattlemen and cattlewomen across the entire country, and of course right here in Western Ag Network country. And during this year's Montana Stockgrowers Association's annual convention here in Billings, one of this year's speakers was Troy Applehans from CattleFax, and he's our guest today, and we're lucky enough to have Troy in Big Sky Country. And Troy, you basically started your presentation off during this convention by saying, are you ready to make a little bit of money? And you followed that up by saying, for the first time in a long time, cow-calf producers, which makes up the majority of the livestock industry here in these parts, is back to having a little bit of leverage. Walk us through that.
It's been a long time coming, hasn't it, Russell?
It has been.
You know, these cow-calf producers have really probably suffered the brunt of the reduction or lack of profitability of any segment in this business. And it's really been a function of during the last cattle cycle when we expanded, one of the most rapid expansion rates that we've ever gone through in history during 2014. We shut down a lot of packing capacity due to the reduction in supply going into that time frame, and then all of a sudden we expanded to the levels where all of a sudden we had too many cattle than the industry could harvest. And therein lied the problem in terms of the lack of leverage that just continued to worsen from 2016, obviously all the way into 2020-21 time frame. The packer was getting more of the piece of the pie than any other segment out there. That's fixing to change.
That was music to these producers' ears here at the Montana Stockgrowers Convention for sure, but it doesn't go without its fair share of challenges. I mean, nobody's complaining about this cattle market being back up on the upside of things, but especially up here in the northern part of America, I mean, most of these guys have been faced with one of the worst droughts in recent memory.
Not just up here, Russell. I mean, it's really been, when we look at in terms of the percentage of the total beef cow herd that has endured at least some sort of drought, particularly in the two worst extreme in the exceptional or extreme categories of drought. We've got 35% of the nation's cow herd that has endured some of that this year, and over 50% of the entire nation's cow herd that has been in some form of drought. That's led to obviously massive liquidation within the cow side, right? And that's what can lead to these higher prices going forward. But we're fully anticipating a million head fewer cows as of January 1 when the USDA inventory report comes out.
So if drought wasn't a big enough challenge, then you throw in some of the highest input costs that we've had also in recent memory, whether it be feedstuffs or on the energy side. That's also kind of having an overall impact, obviously, on profitability in the cow-calf sector specifically.
These cow costs have just continued to get higher, right? I mean, particularly when you look at the added input costs that we're going through today, as you alluded to, energy, feed, whatever the case may be. Cow prices aren't getting any cheaper and calf prices haven't kept pace. That's obviously been a struggle. That's obviously been to the detriment of a lot of the cow-calf sector in terms of profitability. We don't need to lose any of these cow-calf producers, right? It's kind of one of those things, we don't have enough of them maybe as it stands today. And it's been one of those things where these droughts and these cattle cycles are either economically or environmentally driven. And this one has been a little dose of both of those.
Well, I know you guys always have your noses right in what's going on with the entire industry and all the different movers and shakers within it. As you guys are looking into 2023, Troy, I mean, what are we looking? I mean, farmers are still going to plant lots of corn, especially with where that corn market at. The hay production kind of depends on whether or not we can get this drought broke, but I mean, are we going to have plenty of feedstuffs in the new year?
It remains to be seen, all right? Mother Nature can be pretty fickle and pretty cruel, but we are anticipating, at least our meteorologists are anticipating, a return to more normal type weather conditions, Russell, going forward. And so that's probably likely to happen, at least by their estimation, by next spring, going into spring of 2023. And going forward, the increases of an El Nino type of weather pattern or a wetter weather pattern increasing those chances going forward as well. I think it's probably a tale of two halves. You know, if we might not have significant moisture conditions early in the year, but by the second half we should certainly have normal type conditions. We need a big crop of hay and corn in order to reduce these prices that we've seen.
Well, absolutely, you know, and one of the things that traditionally has helped out the markets here at home have been those export markets. Walk us through some of the highlights there, because we are still getting U.S. beef around the world to some very important markets, and that is having a positive impact on prices here at home.
Our foreign consumers have gotten a really good taste of U.S. beef and how good it is, and they've certainly been willing to pay for it. Japan and South Korea remain our two largest export markets, although China, for the past couple of months, has been the second largest importer of U.S. beef. It's kind of hard to have all your eggs in one basket in China. You don't want to put too many of them there. We know they're a fickle type country, and they can shut it off just as quickly as they can turn it on. But the bottom line is that our main export partners, as well as these other countries, have been very, very good for us. We're expecting total exports to be up about 4% this year. Previous year they were up 16%. So it's been a good market for us. One of the challenges there, Russell, has been the strength of the U.S. dollar and how it competes with those other currencies. We know that the South Korean and Japanese currencies have lost some ground when it pertains to the U.S. dollar, and that makes it a little bit tougher for them to get our product in. At least it makes it more expensive for them, but they've got the taste for the good stuff and they want it.
Absolutely. Just remind folks at home, what that means as far as that added value dollar, what those export markets return on investment, so to speak.
Well, just to when you look at total export value per head, it's about $450 per head. That's pretty significant. In other words, if we lost the export market for whatever reason, hopefully that never happens to us, like similar to the way it did in December of 2003, we could take $450 a head off this market in a heartbeat. Hopefully that doesn't happen. But when we look at the net balance of trade, we're still a net profit country. In terms of when we look at exports versus imports, we're still making about $1.6 billion to the good. But that export market at $450 a head, that's pretty significant.
Now, on the other side of the coin, during your presentation here in Billings at the Montana Stockgrowers Convention, we talk about the positives of the export markets. You said on the other side, because of where we're at with overall cattle numbers here, we're also seeing a surge, if you will, of some import cattle coming in. Tell us why.
Well, 50-55% of total beef consumption here domestically is in the form of ground beef. And certainly with the cow liquidation that we've seen over the past couple of years, we've been able to largely meet that demand. But going forward, particularly when we're estimating 800,000 fewer non-fed cattle killed next year, in terms mostly cows, we're going to short the market of 90% trim. And so we've got to get that from someplace in order to meet the demand. And obviously Canada and Mexico, we import enough product from them, but also coming into the mix is you're seeing Brazil be a bigger player in that as well. And then Australia's been in a major drought, and they've been in an expansion mode, but that expansion is starting to hit the market, which again gives not only Japan and South Korea another alternative for some grain-fed beef, but we're also going to get a little bit more of that product into the U.S. as well.
Let's talk about beef consumption here at home. And consumers are facing some challenges in the pocketbook. We've got an inflation kind of underway. Food costs are going up. Let's talk about how those rising food costs are affecting their buying habits at the meat case, more specifically when choosing what protein they want, in which this case, cattle producers want them choosing beef.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that we're concerned about going forward, Russell, and we've got some of that factored into the equation already in terms of our overall outlook into next year. We've got weaker demand coming forward for beef, simply due to some of those headwinds economically that you're discussing. And we also know that when in tougher economic times it inadvertently impacts these lower income type producers more so than anything. And so we have to look at our competition. What are they producing? What is their price going to be? So far, so good. The price of ground beef is very competitive with the price of pork. It's also very competitive with the price of a boneless, skinless chicken breast at this particular time. But going forward, we have to keep an eye on that because we can do some demand destruction simply due to the highest price of beef. And we know that beef is the most vulnerable in tougher times because it's the most expensive product.
Troy, bringing our conversation today full circle now. The biggest question that these folks here at this convention and across America when we're talking about the beef cattle industry right now is what are you folks at CattleFax projecting price-wise in 2023? Not just this coming spring, but I think for these cow-calf guys up here in states like Montana, what are those steer prices going to be next fall?
Yeah, Russell, that's as we know, most of the people in this part of the world are going to be concerned about what calf prices are doing next fall. Quite frankly, we're estimating, and we're using 550-pound steer as our base for a U.S. average, but we're estimating a $2.25 market next year for average. Certainly, the spring time frame is when you see your peak demand and your highest prices, and Mother Nature is going to deter those potential highs this spring a little bit. But going into next fall, we could certainly have $2.10, $2.15 calves in this part of the world, or even higher. We're always having to watch out for these black swan type of events that seem to sideline these markets a little bit, and they've become much more prevalent lately. But calf prices that are certainly going to be above this year into next fall time frame.
Well, fingers crossed that Troy and the rest of the CattleFax team there in Denver have their data correct. It's certainly been good and fun to see this cattle market back up to where it probably should be or should have been, and hopefully will continue to be moving forward. Troy, thank you for coming up here to Montana and being part of this year's Montana Stockgrowers Association convention.
My pleasure to visit with you.
And of course, as we turn the corner into 2023, one of the highlights for the cattle industry, as well as folks across America and those attendees headed for the cattle industry's annual convention and NCBA trade show, is the CattleFax's annual market outlook and weather forecast for the coming year. And of course, that's always a highlight at the NCBA's annual convention, headed for New Orleans in February of 2023. In the meantime, though, for more details and for more market analytical data from our friends at CattleFax, the best bet is just to jump online and visit their website. Well, one of the highlights each year at the Montana Stockgrowers Association's annual convention is getting a policy update from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association out of Washington, D.C. And joining us here in Billings this year was the NCBA's Vice President of Government Affairs, Ethan Lane. And first of all, Ethan, thank you so much for coming back out to Big Sky Country and joining us cattlemen and cattlewomen out here for the MSGA annual convention.
You know, honestly, it doesn't feel like the Christmas season has started until I've come to the Northern Hotel for a couple days. It's usually the last stop on my tour. It's one of my favorite meetings of the year. I'm excited to be here.
Well, and we warmed it up for your Arizona blood too. I think it's a balmy 5 above outside right now.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, it's almost hot. I mean, I'm glad I didn't bring a big coat or anything.
Well, you just actually finished addressing the noon luncheon here at the convention, and you went over some of the key priority issues for NCBA in the coming year. Big news this week, I guess, for the cattle industry as the USDA finally rolled out that finalized cattle contract library rule. What's that all mean, and what is NCBA's position on that?
So what we have is a cattle contract library pilot program. And this was created in last year's appropriations package. It basically gives USDA the ability to work on a cattle contract library that would give producers more transparency and more information about how some of these alternative marketing agreements that we've talked about so much over the last couple of years are used, and you know, where some of those premiums are being derived, a little bit of a peek behind the veil, and I know that's been a source of a lot of consternation for producers around the country, particularly those that don't use them. So this has been a big item on our agenda. This is something that NCBA has policy to support. We've worked extensively with Capitol Hill. We've worked with the agency on this, and we now have a final rule that will guide that pilot for the rest of the year. And what they'll do is they'll get that information out there. It's going to be a weekly report from the packers on all of the cattle they've acquired through those AMAs over the previous week, different types, what kind of pricing mechanisms and things like that, what kind of terms, and they'll put that out in an aggregated report. So no specific proprietary contract information. It's just like the rest of LMR. It's going to be kind of buckets of information. And we'll see how it's used and whether or not it's beneficial for producers. And then we'll kind of revisit it next fall and figure out where we go from there.
Well, from what I read this week, it kind of puts the cattle industry more in par with what the hog industry has been doing for a few years now.
It does, but in going through this process, and NCBA had a working group last year that really kind of dug into this concept. What we found was largely producers didn't want something that mimicked the swine contract library too much. That hasn't been a terribly useful product. So we're looking for ways to start there and improve upon it to make sure that it's something our producers will actually benefit from. And that's what we're working on with USDA right now.
Of course, markets have been a big topic for cattlemen and cattlewomen across this country for a couple years now. Well, really, since the dawn of time, since we got going on in the cattle industry from the get-go. But it was highlighted, during the COVID pandemic, and certainly a lot of different organizations have been working on, addressing this competition issue, addressing market transparency out there in the marketplace. NCBA hasn't ran away from that either. I mean, talk about, what NCBA's thoughts are on these competition bills. And there's a couple different versions working their way through Congress.
There are, and we're at the end of the 117th Congress, and people forget, it's kind of a reset button going into the next Congress. Bills have to be reintroduced if they're gonna move again. All these discussions start over, and what we've seen is a couple of years of pretty robust discussion on these concepts, particularly the Fisher-Grassley bill, which is like the fourth version of different kinds of minimum mandatory cash trade requirement bills, starting with Senator Grassley's 5014 concept, and then looping in Senator Fisher's regionalized concept, and this is now like the second hybrid of that. And they keep trying to figure out how to find the sweet spot for that. We're in the last 2 weeks of this Congress. It's not likely that bill is going to move. NCBA remains opposed to it because it puts the onus on producers to change their marketing methods. And we have policy that says that we don't want anything to restrict our producers' ability to market their cattle in the way they see fit to market them that's best for their business. We do, however, want to make sure that we're paying a lot of attention to transparency and to that price discovery mechanism. So we're working with the ag econ community, we're working with Congress, we're working with our producers around the country, looking for those ways to increase transparency. The cattle contract library is a big part of that. That's an important extra tool in the toolbox for producers. But we're also watching that natural cattle cycle move as we know that it does, and we heard from CattleFax this morning about that, and we're seeing those prices improve. We're seeing that leverage pendulum swing back towards producers again, in exactly the way that the economic community has been telling us that it would for the last couple years. So, it's one eye towards where can we learn from the last few years, and another eye towards let's not get in the way of a market that's recovering and do something that's gonna cause us some problems down the road. So we're kind of trying to keep an eye on a balance between those two things, and look for more opportunities moving forward.
So after countless number of extensions, just recently the Department of Transportation and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration decided not to extend that ELD and hours of service regulation that the trucking industry, more specifically U.S. livestock haulers, have been working under for the past couple of years now. Was that a surprise, and is it disappointing?
So we had kind of two pieces of information happen at once here. We had a petition we submitted 4 years ago asking for more flexibility on hours of service. And at the beginning of COVID, we applied for and secured an emergency declaration to suspend those requirements so that producers could get cattle where they needed to go. Obviously with a million head backlog in the system, we needed flexibility to go where we had to go. That was extended about every month to 3 months for several years during COVID. In October, FMCSA decided not to grant another extension on that, and their reasoning for that was President Biden said the pandemic's over, so we can't keep giving you a pandemic emergency declaration. Then a month later, they revisited this petition from 4 years ago and said, well, in the last 4 years, you've secured a back-end 150 air mile exemption and a front-end 150 air mile exemption. So you basically got the flexibility that you asked for in this petition, so we're denying the petition. That doesn't leave us where we need to be. It doesn't lose any ground, but it's one more avenue that's closed now. We'll have to revisit, okay, where do we go from here to keep looking for a way to bump that flexibility out? What we've learned during the pandemic is our safety record has been exemplary. There have been no problems operating under that emergency declaration, so we know that it's safe. We just need to work with FMCSA and Congress to find that sweet spot to get the flexibility that we need for our producers.
One of the biggest fears for the livestock industry and producers is the introduction of an animal disease not not found here in America. And, with that said, I mean, what is NCBA doing? And just talk about the real threat that lies down in Brazil when it comes to either BSE or foot and mouth disease.
Well, we haven't seen FMD in this country since the 1920s, and we don't want to see it again. We see the effects still. We still talk about, the cow that stole Christmas, the BSE case in 2003. These are things that haunt the industry for months and years after an outbreak. So we want to be really, really sober about how we go into those conversations. When we have trading partners that don't follow the same rules that we do, and in this case we're talking about Brazil, NCBA has taken a really strident position here. We had 2 atypical BSE outbreaks in Brazil last year that they failed to report for 74 days. The World Organization for Animal Health requires you to report those in 24 hours. And atypical BSE, remember, is not the same as classical. It's spontaneously occurring. It's not indicative of an outbreak, but it does test the system, right? That's how we know the system of reporting works. So if you don't use the system, if you're not playing by those rules, you shouldn't be allowed to bring beef into the best beef market in the world, which is the United States. So we've called on USDA twice now to suspend Brazil's access to the United States. We're going to keep calling on them to suspend Brazil's access to the United States. We're extremely grateful for the support we've seen on that from folks like Senator Tester and others that have jumped into that fight along with us, because it is a serious issue we need to pay attention to. We can't have folks engaging in our marketplace here that aren't honest brokers, and we just haven't had that kind of good sportsmanship from Brazil when it comes to that issue. And that's not a reason to throw trade out the window. We have $10 billion in exports out of this country just through October of this year. We're on track to have our biggest export year ever. That's $475 on every fed steer into the system. That's incredibly important. But the other side of that pendulum, of that about 11% of products sold in the United States that is coming in, the majority of that's lean trim, we want to make sure that's safe and at the same standard as our standard, which is the highest in the world. We don't think Brazil meets that right now, and so we're asking USDA to take action on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of different acronyms we talk about in the agriculture industry, and one of the biggest acronyms and one of the biggest issues that NCBA has been really a leader on here in the past, I don't know, maybe 10 years, has been the waters of the U.S. rule and WOTUS. And Mark Twain, once coined the phrase, whiskey's made for drinking and water's made for fighting. And boy, he couldn't have been more right. How big of a deal is WOTUS? I mean, we had a big win during the Trump administration when it came to WOTUS, and now it's like we're back to the drawing board.
WOTUS feels like the tide coming in and out. Depending on the administration, you get a far-reaching rule, and then you get a Republican administration that reins it back in. But federal rulemakings take years. Rulemakings like this take an entire 4-year presidency to get something across the finish line. We saw that in the Obama administration. We saw it again in the Trump administration. We're waiting now for the Supreme Court to rule on a case that's going to have a lot of bearing on how far the EPA can go in crafting yet another new rule. That new rule is already crafted. It's been washed through the White House's process at OMB and is ready to be released. We are expecting to see it any day. I mean, quite literally, we could see it while we're sitting here this afternoon. But they're releasing that rule in an environment where we are pretty sure we're going to see the Supreme Court at least rein in their authority to extend control over vast expanses of the American landscape. I mean, coming from a state like Arizona, where the whole state is basically a WOTUS, that's real. So we really kind of have a two-ring circus going on at the moment. Whatever EPA puts out is undeniably going to be impacted by the Supreme Court decision that will come at some point after that, and then we'll see where we are, and we'll see kind of how far they can go. We'll see what kind of challenges to that rule will exist because of that ruling, and undoubtedly we'll find ourselves back in the court system.
Hey, before I let you out of the hot seat, one last question. I mean, as we roll into 2023, just like every other agricultural organization out there, talk about your Farm Bill priorities and what NCBA is going to be working Capitol Hill on when it comes to the U.S. cattlemen and cattlewomen.
So the Farm Bill process is going to be a really tough one this year. We've been spending money in the federal government, as everybody knows, for the last 3 or 4 years at a pretty aggressive clip. And this new class coming in, the Republicans taking control of the House, are going to be much more fiscally conservative than what we've seen the last few years. That's bad news when you're in a high inflation environment and you have an $800 billion bill that probably needs to be a $1 trillion bill just to get the same bang for the buck that we got in 2018. That's the starting point. And we know we're looking at some programs. We want to make sure we protect, funding for that FMD vaccine bank that we secured in the last bill. It's critically important to make sure that America is ready to respond if there were to be an outbreak at some point. These are rounding error budget items in the grand scheme of things, right? 20 million, 30 million, 40 million in an $800 billion bill is, you hate to say it that way, but it's pennies based on what you could see as far as economic impact if we were to have an outbreak.
Well, and it's pennies compared to what we spent and what the government doled out in COVID money.
Well, absolutely, right? And that's exactly why we're kind of going to now be victims of that, right, in the Farm Bill process. But we have newly minted Republican members coming from rural districts that have said flat out, I'm not voting for a Farm Bill. I think it's bad policy. So we have a really big hill to climb. We've got to educate them about the conservation programs that our producers use, the disaster programs that are critical for our producers, whether it's drought, whether it's fire, whether it's floods, you name it. When we need those resources, those things come in awfully handy. We also need to educate them about the increased use of risk management tools like LRP. That's a tool that a few years ago we weren't hearing much about, and because of some changes in access, it's far more attractive for cattle producers now. We're hearing about it everywhere we go, but that also means it's an additional cost, and some of that cost is borne by resources in the Farm Bill. So we need to make sure that USDA gets the resources they need. We also need to make sure that this bill doesn't go off down any rabbit trails, right? We don't need to have a big, robust, climate discussion. We don't need to have some of these things that get away from the core priorities. And of course, you're going to have the other side of the coin, those urban members dealing with the nutrition programs, SNAP and WIC, and the huge amount of money those programs require. It's a big political mess, but we're going to do our best to educate about what cattle producers need out of that process, and then you kind of get to stand out of the way and let them fight it out.
Well, we've just basically scratched the surface, friends, on what NCBA is working on behalf of both their members and non-members every single day back in our nation's capital there in Washington, D.C. And I can't forget to mention these topics and a whole lot more will also be covered the first week of February during the Cattle Industries Convention and NCBA Trade Show, headed for the always fun New Orleans. You can find more details online by visiting convention.ncba.org. And who knows, you just might see our network's Lane Nordland down on Bourbon Street, either karaokeing or putting his dance moves on.